They called us a lesson in comparative folklore, a punchline that drifted through academy taverns and bored naval briefings, a cobweb in the starlit corners of the Empire's memory. And so, the high conclave of the Vejari convened beneath their vaulted aurora glass and traded jokes about the hairless apes of old Terra, while their admirals flicked talons over holocharts and marked the rim with campaigns that would fatten ledgers and reputations. Cadets recited the myth as a rite of boredom, humans who burned worlds with chemical fire and hurled metal slugs as if the galaxy were a medieval siege. And professors in the archive of vanished species waved the story away with soft smiles and citations, blaming merchant exaggeration and mistranslations for anything that sounded too sharp to be true. Because the universe was civilized now, tidy in its cruelty, mediated by treaties and acceptable casualties. And the idea that something as stubborn and inelegant as humanity had once stalked the space lanes felt like a primitive ghost raised to frighten children. The fleet auditors called it noise, the senators called it nostalgia, and the admirals, hungry and sleek in their dress scales, called it irrelevant, until the arrays at Lagrange 9 tasted a signal from the black between two dull stars, and the great machinery of certainty found a grain of stone in its perfect gears. It was nothing, of course. The watch officers agreed, an unlicensed beacon or a pirate's mimicry, yet they flagged it for training value, and the war room played it over and over, not for its content. The signal carried no message in the obvious sense, but for the way it refused entropy, a filament that did not curl when it should, a rhythm of prime intervals layered with a whisper of red-shifted hymnals that no spectral library could parse, like the echo of a cathedral sluiced through vacuum. And because pride loves demonstrations, the conclave authorized a local probe with a screen of destroyers to humor the archivists, while ambassadors arranged a statement in advance mocking the inevitability of superstition, and the fleet moved with the confidence of a schoolyard tyrant who already knows the punchline. When the task force reached the coordinates, they found a hole in the starfield where coordinates were supposed to be, a trapdoor of darkness, not absence but cancellation, as if something were there and somehow refused to be measured. And the chief sensorist, who had scanned 1,000 anomalies, felt the bruise of wrongness press against the skull behind his eyes and asked permission to recalibrate. Denied. Proceed, Commander. The Admiralty wants a result before dinner. And so they mapped the void with lattice LiDAR. Fired good, expensive math into nothing, and received returns that did not look like returns, just ripples in the gravitational glass. A hint of mass where mass would not admit itself, and the jokes thinned. Command expanded the cordon, a doctrinal show of force. Frigates fanned out with shields in parade-bright glory. Destroyers anchored a kill box in the sky, and the senator aboard the flagship rehearsed her lines about the triumph of rational order to deliver to the holodome back home, even as the junior officers noticed that the void, the not quite nothing, seemed to slowly articulate edges the way a tide articulates a coastline. Then the hymn threaded itself through every band at once, not loud and not musical, but undeniable, a low, steady pressure that laid a hand on the interior of the skull and made the word hush form without instruction, and the astrogation screens glitched to black, then to text older than any of them had ever seen in a military context, blocky, utilitarian characters that looked like a promise composed by a shipyard. Stand clear of vector. At precisely the moment the Admiral ordered a counterjam, and the frigates lit their countermeasures, the space inside the cordon buckled with prickles of ice along the teeth. Stars shivered in their places, and something larger than the sum of their fleet shed its disguise with the weary elegance of a leviathan rising from cold water, plating birthing reflections across hulls that had never been so honestly arrayed before a mirror. There it was at last, no longer rumor, No longer academic cautionary tale, but geometry given purpose. An angular vessel with edges drawn by an engineer who had chosen function over beauty and achieved both by refusing to care. A spinal architecture threaded the length of its kilometers like a weaponized cathedral nave, armored ribs overlapping like glaciers, heat scar engravings that read like history written in physics, and along its flanks ran stenciled warnings in a language the archivists recognized in a silent, horrified simultaneity: English. Followed by an identifier that inverted the room temperature composure of every officer who could read: TCS Dreadnought Nemesis. The word Dreadnought had survived the centuries like a flint shard in the soft belly of modernity, a design philosophy so unfashionable it had to be mythical, and yet the ship wore it without hubris, as if the appellation were merely accurate, like calling a mountain a mountain. Comms lit with panicked, then professional, then disciplined attempts to hail, interrogate, warn, and threaten. And inside the flagship's command amphitheater, the admiral's voice narrowed to the wire-thin timbre of someone standing between protocol and recognition of a shape in the dark that ancient instincts have already catalogued. For the Nemesis made no gesture of aggression, merely maneuvered, a small word for how the constellation seemed to tilt when it adjusted orientation. And the Vejari destroyers felt the change as a soft jolt across inertial dampers and a brief temptation in their fire control to drift off target by half a degree. A cloak, someone said, as if nomming it would shrink it, and the archivist assigned for ridicule heard herself whisper, "No, not a cloak. A refusal," because the data said the ship had been there all along, wearing the lie of empty space the way a deep predator wears stillness. Then the voice arrived, not on audio, not stamped with terror or dominance, but as text and time-stamped instructions that appeared in every system's console in a font that meant business. Do not lock TARGETS on Terran asset. Do not vector through line of fire. Do not interfere with quarantine protocol. The phrase Terran asset moved through the fleet like a cold wind through a field of chimes, and the admirals, finally remembering their mandate to show the galaxy that superstition has no teeth, gave the order to paint targets and watch the human myth blink. Fire control reacted with crisp obedience and froze halfway through obedience, because the firing solutions never resolved, because the math underneath the locks yielded not a no, but an impossibility, like trying to sight a spear through a waterfall that changes course mid-air at the whisper of intent. The Nemesis spoke again, not to them but to the battlefield itself. Fields bent, oscillators that had never failed wavered, missiles in their racks thought about being inert. And across the capital ships, armored decks, old, unpublicized nightmares whispered awake, strings in the code that should not exist, safeguards that had never needed testing, and where electronic war should have turned into an exchange of noisy tricks, there was only the quiet arrival of superior assumptions. And because pride is a poor strategist, the Vejari flagship pushed a kinetic lance to launch anyway. One clean Newtonian argument shoved into vacuum to assert that mass and velocity answer all philosophies. But the round did not make it to the void, not because of a visible shield, but because the space ahead of the gun drifted a hair to the left, and the barrel found that it was pointing into a coordinate that had not existed a heartbeat before. And the lance eased out like a sigh and went nowhere useful. And the shock of that tiny failure rippled through the bridge greater than the shock of any explosion. Then the Nemesis acted, not like a predator gorging, but like a gardener pruning. With the smallest gestures of force, almost kind, it pinched the claws off the fleet one by one, a soft exaggeration of gravity here to unseat a rail battery, a precise quench of field harmonics there to put a hangar into deep safe, a gentle nudge in vectors to herd a destroyer out of a collision path before it realized it had been pushed. And when a frigate attempted the stupidity that bravery sometimes becomes and angled for a ramming solution, the human ship altered that frigate's inertia so that it coasted, feather-light, to a stop relative to a chosen point, and hung there like a fish on clean water admiring a shadow. The Vejari senator, who had prepared sarcasm for superstition, found that her voice could offer only silence, and the admiral found that every order forced through his teeth returned as acknowledgement without effect, as though the carrier were a toy in a hand too gentle to break. And then, in a gesture as intimate as a fingertip tapping a microphone, all the grand networks of the empire heard a chime. Senators mid-speech stuttered and fell silent. Academies paused lectures. Border garrisons turned